Well, we now come to our fourth session in our study of the prophetic genre, and I call this Foretelling Analysis. Foretelling Analysis. And this is what we think of sometimes when we say prophetic, right? This is the aspect of the prophetic genre where there is about a prediction of an event that will take place in the future. That's what foretelling is. Sometimes you'll hear the idea of forthtelling. That's the same thing as like sermonic or just the passage itself. When it's just not giving a prediction of a future. It's just talking about current events. And so that's wrapped up in the sermon analysis. But foretelling is when you think about the future. So a major aspect of prophetic genre is that the passages that predict events that will take place in a future time frame or future time period. This aspect of prophetic genre, we call it the predictive part of it, is called foretelling. Now, foretelling is not the same as forthtelling. I just kind of mentioned that, but they're different. Even though both appear in the prophetic genre, especially the sermons, but even within sermons, you can have foretelling. But both appear, forthtelling and foretelling, they're distinct from each other in that forthtelling is concerned about current events from the perspective of the author or the prophet, while foretelling is concerned about events that would happen in the future from the same perspective of the author or the prophet. Now, some want to believe that the majority of prophetic genre is solely focused on foretelling, this predictive aspect of Scripture. Now, the book of Revelation, yes, it's highly predictive about future events. But that really doesn't start till a few chapters into the book. However, to say that every passage, every prophetic genre passage is predictive in nature is just not the case. I remember when I became a new believer and I was starting to study the Bible, and I thought about it. I actually held to that view. I thought all prophetic genre, all prophetic passages are predictive and they're going to talk about the future. And I didn't really understand then. You know, I was very young and I didn't understand how to look at a prophetic passage. It's just not the case. But you will find it. It is there. And forthtelling is a major part of the prophetic genre. I think it dominates. But foretelling, the predictive aspect, is apparent. It is there. So when you've come across those kinds of passages, you could have a passage that is narrative or poetic or both, that has a sermon within it, and within that sermon is predictions. So you see how this is interesting how it could lay out. Now you can have predictions made that's not a part of a sermon, but it'll appear in narrative or poetical form. So it's a type of aspect that you want to be aware of and learn to detect. And usually you would detect it as you're doing your narrative analysis, poetical analysis, or a combination of the both. That's why we start with narrative and poetical analysis. You start there, and then that helps you see if it's a sermon or if it's foretelling, and you can begin to say, okay, then I got to do a deep dive down into that aspect of it and see what I discover. So what would be the procedure, the official procedure? Well, the important aspect to understanding when foretelling appears, you got to be able to do the following, okay? When it appears, you got to be able to do the following. Number one, you got to identify the specific prophetic event that is being mentioned. What is being predicted? You got to try to identify it in some kind of way, okay? That's the first aspect. How do you identify it? We're going to talk about that in class. Okay? Just right now, I'm just trying to get the procedure, just kind of get it before you so you think through it. We're going to be doing this in class. That's why it's important to come to class, okay? You got to identify the specific prophetic event. You may say, well, I don't know what it is. Well, try to describe it in the best terms possible. Then try to identify the specific time frame in which the event will take place. Now this, you can use study tools that are available on the internet. Remember Bible.org, some of these things that we talked about in course number 1, some of these websites, online commentaries can sometimes help. And you want to use commentaries correctly. But when you're examining and examining the passage and trying to identify the specific time frame, you're not saying, okay, what is the year, like 1908 or 2020, something like that. You're not trying to think of it that way. But you're trying to think of it in 3 possible categories. Is the event being predicted? Is it a near future event? It's still future, but near. Now, the word near is in connection with the author, not you and me. It's connection with the author from the perspective of the author. Meaning, is it within the Old Testament time frame? So the event that is predicted, does it take place within the Old Testament time period? If it is, that's classified as a near future event. So from our perspective, it's already happened. It was predicted at that time when it was spoken to the people, but in actuality, it's already taken place. Okay? Or you could have what's called a distant future event. That is that the event is still, from our perspective, it's already occurred. It's already happened. It's history. But it happened not within the Old Testament time frame, it happened within the New Testament time frame. So you got near future, distant future, and then we have far distant future, and that's the exciting part because that's after the New Testament timeline and beyond. These are events not 100%. They still could have been events that were already, from our perspective, have already taken place, even though it happened after the New Testament time period. But the New Testament timeline was the first 100 years. Most of the beyond is what still is future to us. And that's the predictive part that we want to really discover. That's the part that's really intriguing. The events that are spoken of in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, especially in the book of Revelation, that are far distant future. Now, to us, these far distant future events that were far distant to the authors who wrote about them, we may be closer to them, right? We don't know when they will occur, exact dates and time frames. But when you think about events that are predicted in the Old Testament passages, New Testament passages, you have to ask yourself, if it's foretelling, which of the 3 categories will it fit? You got to know that. You got to be able to discover that. How do you do that? How do you identify this prediction? And how do you identify what time frame category to put it in? That I'm going to discuss in class. It's best to do it in class and have you engaged as we talk in class. But I wanted to get this in front of you. This is what we're going to be doing in class. This is the procedure. So how does this work? You observe and you note all details, exegetical details, as to the nature of the future event being described in the sense of what is being predicted to happen, as to if there are any conditions that could allow that event to be avoided. You want to know that as well. So you want to observe everything you can. Sometimes an event is predicted to happen in the future, but it never came about. Does that mean God's not true? No, it means there was a condition that had to be met for the event not to take place. The event could have been avoided. But then there are some events that are predicted. There is no doubt about it. It's going to happen, or it has already happened. God returning to earth and establishing His kingdom. That is an event that will take place. No doubt about it. There's no conditions placed on that one. But you got to take a look at each of the events, identify the specific prophetic event and the time frame in which time frame category that it's going to appear, and observe and note all the exegetical details you can. Note any particularities about it, And you got to note that on your paper. You got to be able to observe those things and make notations about that. And that's what I'm going to do for you in class. I'm going to show you how to do this stuff, how to look at these passages and be able to examine it. And another thing you have to do, you have to realize that foretelling can appear at any time in prophetic genre, especially within sermonic passages. It can just show up. It could be just one verse within a larger section, or it could be the whole entire section. Look at Ezekiel chapter 38, 39. That is a foretelling event. That is a prediction of an event that will take place, and it's described in detail. It's described in detail. Now, you have to decide, when you read that, which category does it fall in? And what is the specific identification for it? But you follow this pattern. You follow this procedure. You identify the specific event as best as you can. Try to describe it in whatever way you can. And then you place it into a time frame category. And if it's an event that's, from our vantage point, already taken place, you try to provide the data to provide the historical reference, either a biblical passage or some historical reference that you found that talked about it being completed. That's what you got to do. And in class, we're going to talk about this. I'm going to show you this. We're going to work through passages. We're going to spend a good amount of time, a good 6 hours at least, looking through just foretelling. We're going to go through various passages because this is where the prophetic aspect of it, the predictive aspect of it is intriguing, but at the same time sometimes difficult for pastors and exegetes to be able to discover. And you gotta learn the methodology. You gotta practice the methodology. When you do that, it comes together in a great way, and it'll make you excited for studying, what we call biblical prophecy, the predictive aspects of it. So that's the simple procedure. We're going to follow that pattern, follow that procedure in class with many different passages. We'll interact with each other. I think you're going to enjoy the discussion. So now, before we conclude this lesson, I'm going to give you some examples, though. Just give you a few examples of these time frame categories, of passages that relate to each of the time frame categories, just to kind of give you another perspective, kind of help get the juices flowing and help you to get an understanding of some of these passages and how they break down in terms of their specific time frame category. So the first example I want to show you is example of passages, prophetic passages, predictive passages that appear in the near future category. So that means from the perspective of the author, they're going to happen in the future, but from our perspective, they've already taken place because they were fulfilled within the Old Testament time frame. The first example is Nahum chapter 1 verse 10 and chapter 3 verse 15. The passage should appear on the screen, and here's kind of what it says. It says, "For they are like entangled thorns, like drunkards as they drink. They are consumed like stubble, fully dried. There will the fire devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust. Multiply like the grasshopper." So in this passage, Nahum is describing the city of Nineveh and how God is going to destroy it. You say, well, what's the point of these two verses? It's to give you a history lesson. Remember, these passages have already been fulfilled. This has already happened. And he's talking about the destruction that will happen to Nineveh. From his perspective, it will happen in the future. But there was this ancient historian, Diodorus Scilius. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but that's the best I can do. He wrote about that event, about the destruction of Nineveh, 600 years after it happened. And in his writing, in his history book, he quotes this. He says this: "The Assyrian king gave much wine to his soldiers." It was the Assyrians that came in and destroyed that this happened to. "Deserters told this to the enemy who attacked that night." So the king of Assyria, which is the king over Nineveh, he gave his own people, wine. They got drunk. And deserters told their enemy that. Isn't it interesting how that is mentioned about being drunk in the passage, and the historian comments on that. Did the historian read that biblical text? I doubt it. But it's just something that truly happened. And archaeologists have found a layer of ash covering the ruins of Nineveh. A layer of ash. Why would there be a layer of ash? Oh, if you look back at that passage in chapter 3, it talks about how there will be the fire that will devour you. Fire will devour you. Where did the ash come from? Fire. So again, here's a prediction that was made in the biblical text to the city of Nineveh before they were destroyed, and the actual details were proven to be true. Jeremiah, here's another example. Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 15 and 16. For behold, I will make you small among the nations, despised among mankind. The horror you inspire has deceived you, and the pride of your heart, you who live in the clefts of the rocks, who hold the height of the hill. Though you make your nest as high as the eagles, I will bring you down from there, declares the Lord. And who is he speaking about? He's speaking about the country of Edom. Edom, a neighboring country of Israel. Edom prided themselves. They lived in the rocks. You can see pictures of this online. And they lived in the rocks, and they prided themselves on being undefeatable. Except they were a small country. And the way they worked, the way they operated was when Babylon came into Israel, they hated Israel. So when Babylon came in, they would like join up with Babylon. You know, they were just they were the country that never liked Israel and tried to destroy Israel on their own. Never could do it. But they had this ego and pride. And Jeremiah is telling them from what God had told him, you know what? The pride of your heart, you live in the clefts of the rocks, God's going to bring you down. And you can look at a similar kind of text, Ezekiel chapter 25, verse 14, and even the book of Obadiah. Jeremiah said about 600 years prior to the event that Edom, a longtime enemy of Israel, would be destroyed. And Edom's capital city, Petra, was carved out of a mountainside, and it had great natural defenses. Nonetheless, it was destroyed. It was destroyed. And the kingdom of Edom no longer exists. Ezekiel, writing about 400 years before that same event, said that the Jews would one day take vengeance on Edom. Okay? So, what happened? The Jewish priest king John Hyrcanus the first defeated the Edomites. According to the Columbia Encyclopedia, 5th edition, Edomite history was marked by continuous hostility and warfare with Jews. And at the end of the 2nd century BC, that would be the time between the ending of the book of Malachi before the beginning of the official New Testament. So we'll still call that the Old Testament time period. They were subdued by an Hasmonean priest king John Hyrcanus I, that Jewish king. So what Ezekiel wrote about, Obadiah, Jeremiah, it happened. So these are examples of events that took place in the near future. The actual events took place in the near future from the time that it was spoken. Even though one was 600, one was 400. And one event was written about historically 600 years after. That's one category. Now let's move to the second category. Now the second example area is the distant future time frame category. So these would be a category where the events did take place within the New Testament timeline, or they were fulfilled during the New Testament timeline. So here's one of the passages, Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2, the first phrase of verse 2. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, that's a predictive passage. But from our time frame, it's already taken place. Why do I know that? Because that same passage was quoted by Jesus in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. What is interesting is that the following verse, the next phrase in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 2, he doesn't quote. He stops at the phrase, the Lord's favor. The favorable year of the Lord. He doesn't read the next phrase because that is an event for a far distant future. It's interesting how Jesus did that. He quoted what was fulfilled. He says, this has been fulfilled in your hearing in Luke. That's his commentary. And they wanted to throw him off a cliff for it. But what he left out, what he did not read, he chose not to read it because that is for a far distant future. It wasn't fulfilled on that day. It will be later. Here's another one, Isaiah chapter 8, verse 11 to 15. For the Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me, warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear. Let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken. There's a prediction. He will be a stone of offense. Speaking again of the Messiah. How do I know this is transpired? Because it's quoted by Paul in Romans chapter 8, verse 33, and Peter quotes the same passage in 1 Peter 2:8. They don't quote the entirety of the passage, but they quote the parts that are important for their message or for their letters that they were writing. Who's that stone of offense? It's Christ. It's Jesus. Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, this is a famous passage, especially at Christmas time. But you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. See, there's going to come who will be. He shall come forth. Did he come forth? Yep. This passage was quoted by the chief priests and scribes to Herod in the book of Matthew chapter 2, verse 6. You know what the theme of Matthew is? The whole theme of the gospel is about Jesus being the king. It's him who comes who's ruler. And that's the theme of that passage in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. And it's predictive of the Messiah coming. So these are passages that relate to events, predicted events, that took place. From our perspective, they're fulfilled. They've happened. But from the perspective of the author, they were future, but they were more distant future. And they're usually quoted in the New Testament. You can Google the phrase, Old Testament fulfilled in the New Testament. Google that, and you'll find biblical references, more biblical references, not just from prophetic genre, but even prophetic predictive passages that occur in narrative books. And you'll see when the prediction took place. It's very intriguing. And but this is just 3 examples. So in class, we're going to look at this much more. Well, let me show you the final examples from the final category of far distant future. These are the most intriguing. These are the passages that have not fully occurred yet, even from our time frame. They're beyond us. The first one is Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, chapter 13, verse 1. I don't want to read the whole passage, the entire passage to you, but I want to read this part. Let's start at the beginning, though. Chapter 12, verse 10. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child and weep bitterly over him, as one weeps over a firstborn. On that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rinom in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn. What's going on here? He's talking about a time when all the inhabitants of Jerusalem at exactly the same time are going to mourn over the Son of God, and they're going to mourn as like they mourn for a child who has died, and they're going to weep bitterly like it's their firstborn either being born or dying. It's going to be mourning. It's going to be a sadness, a revelation. What's going to happen is these inhabitants of Jerusalem are going to see the Son of God. And they're going to realize something. They're going to realize that Jesus was really the Messiah. It's all going to connect in their heart and in their mind. He's going to return. This has not happened yet. This is still future, even from our time frame. Yeah, it has not happened yet. So when you study a passage like this, you want to note as many details as possible, because you're trying to understand an event that's going to take place in the future. And this is just one event of many that will take place in the future. And many of these events that take place in the future, described throughout Scripture, are all interconnected with each other. That's the beauty of these things. This is just one aspect. This is when Christ returns in His glory. This is what the Bible would call the second coming of Christ. This is when He comes physically back to earth at the end of what we call the tribulation period, what the Bible calls the tribulation period. And when He comes, everyone sees Him, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. This hasn't happened yet. This event has not yet taken place. When will it take place? We don't know exactly. We don't know the time frame. We don't know the year and the date and the hour, but we know it's still in the future. That's the intriguing part. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, with square and moat, but in a troubled time. And after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood. And to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Guess what? This is a passage where some of the events described here, even though from Daniel's time frame it's all predictive of the future, this is an interesting one. There are some events here that have already taken place historically, in the Old Testament and the New. This one passage has all three categories, interestingly enough. There are aspects here where it's near future, distant future, and far distant future in one passage. So you're kidding me. No, that's the beauty of this thing. Now, when it was originally given by an angel to Daniel, spoken to him, it was all future. But from our vantage point, there's elements that's been fulfilled already, but there's part of it that has not. Oh, and that's the intriguing part. That's the special part. Now here's the deal. In our class, you need to come to class. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 9. We're going to look at it. At the end of this paragraph or in the notes, it says click here to view a visual chart that displays the timeline. Click that and you'll see an image. Now, if you have the notes in front of you, that image is, that chart is on the next page. And we're going to look at that chart in detail and go over this passage, because this is one of those passages that has all 3 time periods in it. That's the beautiful part. It's unbelievable what this passage is saying. I mean, it's just crazy. Just interesting. And so we're going to look at it. Final example, Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 8. This should be a very familiar passage to you. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with him. They will be his people. God himself will be with them as their God. He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. There will be no more mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more. The former things have passed away. Behold, I'm making all things new. Say it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. This is a passage that speaks about the far distant future. None of this has happened yet. This is speaking about our eternal home, eternal glory. It's a beautiful passage from the book of Revelation. A new heaven, new earth. The heaven and earth that we live in, that means the universe that we reside in. Earth represents the planet. Heavens represent not just the sky, but the stellar heavens, what we call the universe. It's all burned away, 2 Peter chapter 3 says. It all melts away, gone, vanish. God creates a new heaven and a new earth. Wow. No more traffic. No more heartache. No more trials. No more suffering. A totally new kind of life. And some people just don't even think it exists or will exist. They don't care. But for those of us who believe in Him, for those of us who truly are followers of Christ and have bowed our knee and been saved and redeemed, we have joy now. But there's the ultimate expression of it. That's heaven. And it's predictive. So that's the final category. We're going to look at all 3 categories. But what we're going to do in class is we're going to go back to Isaiah 6. There is some elements in there that are foretelling. Okay? I'm going to look at that and show it to you in a visual way. But then I'm also going to select some other passages we're going to look at. And Daniel 9 will be one of them. And we're going to spend 2 weeks, if you're doing this in 3-hour sections, we're going to spend about a total of 6 hours on this. And we're going to look at these passages. And we're going to look at foretelling and how important it is to understand this aspect of prophetic genre. Oh, is it going to be good? It's going to be very intriguing. So I look forward to having you in class, seeing you there, and we'll study together and learn together about this element of foretelling. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you in class.